Hi there, you're listening to the Practical Stoic Podcast with your host, me, Simon Drew. If you'd like to listen to over 200 episodes that were recorded before 2020, then you can head to my Patreon site. It's patreon.com/Simon J. E. Drew. We'd love to have you there, and any support is greatly appreciated. We'd love to also have you on our Facebook community, the Practical Stoic Mastermind. But for now, enjoy the show. Hi there, my name's Simon Drew, and welcome to the Practical Stoic Podcast. Now, today I have a really great interview for you that I did with Michael Tremblay. And many of you would probably remember Michael coming on the show, I believe it was last year. And so we do have that interview in my archives on my Patreon site. So just head to patreon.com/Simon J. E. Drew, and you can get access to over 200 episodes that I recorded before 2020. So hopefully you go there and check that out, but if not, that's okay, because this is still such a great conversation to listen to. And we based it all around Hellenistic philosophy, because you've probably heard the phrase Hellenism thrown around a lot. We've talked about it on the show. And these are basically a group of philosophies that were competing against each other during the Hellenistic period. And so I wanted to get an expert on here, somebody who really was studying the Hellenistic philosophies, and somebody who could tell us, what are the main rivals of Stoicism, and how does Stoicism fit into this kind of landscape? And so this was such a great conversation for me. It really opened my eyes to a lot of new information, and I know that it's going to give you guys a bit of a context for where Stoicism grew up, its environment. And so I'm really excited to show you this interview, but first I do want to tell you a little bit about Michael so you have some context for who you're listening to. So Michael Tremblay, he is a PhD student in philosophy at Queen's University. And before going to Queen's, he actually completed a BA and MA in philosophy at Carleton University in Ottawa. During his time at Carleton, he actually wrote a master's thesis on the Stoic Epictetus. His PhD work continues to examine Stoic ethics and the question of how the Stoics thought we should cultivate our virtue. Now, Michael's main interest is in ancient philosophy, specifically moral education in the Stoics. He's also fascinated by the Hellenistic conception of philosophy as a way of life, which is to be practiced in order to achieve virtue and happiness. He's also interested in philosophy as a skill or a craft, and interested in how training and practice factor into becoming a better philosopher, which is awesome, which really aligns with the whole practical Stoic side of things. But beyond philosophy, Michael is also a passionate martial artist, and he regularly competes in Brazilian jiu-jitsu and wrestling. So he's living the life, he's walking the walk, he's talking about philosophy, but he's also implementing it into his life, which is why I absolutely love having a conversation with Michael every time. So I'm really excited for you to listen to this, and I'm going to put all of the links to where you can find Michael's stuff online and where you can follow him. And make sure you get out there, let him know how much you appreciated this conversation. So without any further ado, I present to you Michael Tremblay. Okay, so here we are. Michael, I'm super pumped to have you, as we've been talking about before the show. And we've already spoken on the podcast before, but we're probably going to touch on a lot of the same sort of topics. But just as a little bit of an intro to why I wanted to have you on the show, I know you're very interested in not only Stoicism, but many aspects of life, but also you're very knowledgeable on the Hellenistic philosophy side of things, right? Mm-hmm. And whenever I'm interviewing people, or whenever I hear people talking about Stoicism, the phrase is always, tossed around like, oh, Stoicism is a part of the Hellenistic tradition or the Hellenistic philosophies. And for those people who are just coming into Stoicism, I think you can kind of just gloss over it, but I'd really like to talk to you about, okay, what is this group of Hellenistic philosophies? Where did it come from? And, how does Stoicism fit in there? But let's have a conversation about it. I'm going to let you start where you want to start.
Great.
And we can kind of go from there.
Yeah, sounds good. That's just such a great topic for me, because I find this all very, very interesting.
Oh, so, good. Okay, this is going to be fun.
In terms of what Hellenistic philosophy is, so you have philosophy, which is philosophos, Phil is love, Sophos is wisdom. So philosophy is the love of wisdom, the pursuit of truth.
I'm going to have to stop
And then
you
there's
there. That's already,
Okay.
if people just stop listening to the podcast, that's already enough like awesome value there. Like love of wisdom, breaking philosophy down into essentially what it is. That's like the best, that is the definition of philosophy, and it's the best definition of philosophy, right? Just that love of knowledge and progression.
Yeah, exactly. And because philosophy is this Greek term, right? So it
Mm.
starts. You have the pre-Socratic philosophers who were doing things pre-Socrates, but it wasn't in kind of this formalized system as this. It wasn't thought of as philosophy yet.
Hmm.
And then Socrates comes in, and then his student Plato, and Plato in that system kind of formalizes philosophy and makes it what it is, and has these divisions into like ethics and the questions of what's right and wrong, metaphysics and these questions of what the reality is, how the world works, and these kind of basic divisions that we've kept. That happens around Plato and Socrates. So we see philosophy emerge, and then philosophy is now continued for 2,000 years, right? But there's so many different ways you can take philosophy, because it's the love of wisdom. So in that way, it's the pursuit of truth, and there's a lot of
Mm.
different kinds of truth. So Hellenistic philosophy is a term given to philosophy after Aristotle and
Hmm.
before the medieval period. Okay, so
Mm.
that's the timeline, is after Aristotle and before the medieval period. So historically, you have pre-Socratic philosophers like 500, 600 BC
Hmm.
in Greece. Then you have Socrates, Plato, his student, and then Aristotle is his student. And this is kind of, we see the development of philosophy in the kind of the major schools of ethics and metaphysics and logic, the way we
Mm.
know it today. And then following Aristotle, you get Hellenistic philosophy. And Hellenistic philosophy, what separates it stylistically is it was focused on a question originated by Aristotle, which is what is the content of happiness? So Hellenistic
Mm.
philosophy is all unified by trying to answer the question of what a happy or good life looks like. So
Mm.
in that sense, Hellenistic philosophy is incredibly applied and incredibly practical. There might be this stereotype if you know Kant or Hegel or Heidegger, and you're kind of like, well, what does this have to do with real life? There's this stereotype of philosophy as being esoteric or somehow irrelevant to the real world.
Mm.
And Hellenistic philosophy, I think the appeal to it is it doesn't really have that problem. It's incredibly focused on the real world. It's focused on how should we live, and what's required for a good life. So I don't
Mm.
know. Did you want to stop me, or should I keep going there?
No, I'm very interested in what you're saying there, and I think
Okay.
man, there's so much potential here for us in the future to even come back
Mm.
to all of the schools of philosophy and the different branches essentially. But so you could essentially say that Aristotle created Hellenistic philosophy indirectly, right? Like by essentially offering that question, like what is happiness, right?
Yeah. So I would say that Hellenistic philosophy is riffing on Aristotle, right?
Yeah.
So he
Okay.
kind of, because Aristotle did a lot of things, right?
Mm.
He if all we had was Aristotle's ethics, he'd still be one of the greatest philosophers of all time.
Yeah.
But he basically invented modern biology. He invented formalized logic. He has political theory. He has theory about art. He has all
Mm.
these different branches. So he did so much. But one of his main innovations was this ethical innovation, where he lays it down like this, and he says, "Look, we're interested." This is the Nicomachean Ethics. If anyone wants to dig deeper into this, he said everything is done for a reason, right? He's like, if you do anything, it's for a reason. It's like a 5-year-old kid. If you ask why, you'll get the next
Mm.
reason. Why do you have a job? Well, to make money. Why? Well, to buy a house. Why? Well, so I can have security for myself and my family. Why? And if you ask this question long enough to any person, everybody gets back to the same answer, which is happiness. So
Mm.
everything you do, if you ask why long enough, it gets back to, well, I think that will make me happy. I think that's what a good life is. So
Mm.
Aristotle identifies this. And so he says happiness is the ultimate ends for humans. Everything we do eventually leads back to happiness.
Yeah.
So he establishes that framework. And then he says, well, what the heck does happiness look like? This is a really important question, right? Because if we're all doing it to be happy, we don't want to do the wrong things. We don't want to think happiness consists of popularity, but then we realize that celebrities, they're not very happy. And so if you pursue popularity, it doesn't pay off. We want to know what the content of it is.
Yeah. Now, can I just stop you there for 1 second?
Oh, yeah.
Can we define what they meant by happiness? Because a lot of people who are listening right now might have different ideas of what happiness is, but then we look at the Stoics and their word, eudaimonia, like, which has been roughly translated to like the flourishing life, right? Now, so did Aristotle mean the same thing that we mean by happiness? What did he mean?
So it depends on what people mean by happiness, because if you haven't studied philosophy, you're getting a lot of these concepts just from television or just from conversation or media. And someone just says, I'm happy, or this person isn't happy. So we have this kind of ambiguous concept. So it's helpful to flesh it out. So one thing you could mean by happiness is you could mean just the sensation. Yeah. So you could say, well, I was happy yesterday because I felt good, and I'm not happy today.
Yeah.
And so that's a common way of thinking about it. That's not the way that Aristotle or the Hellenistic philosophers are going to think of it. So the term, as you pointed out, that they use is eudaimonia, and is a prefix which means good. Daimon is the word we get demon from. It means like a guardian spirit. So it's a good spirit. So in that way, you can think of it, it's like you have a good spirit watching over you. So flourish life works, or I think of blessed life in that sense. And so what differs in this conception of happiness is happiness was something that you gauged over an entire lifetime. So Aristotle famously says that, we can't judge if someone was happy until after they died, right? Yeah. Because if you have a good 60 years and then the last 20 years are terrible, well, then if you looked at your life, you wouldn't say, it makes more sense if we say the term like a flourished life or a great life. We wouldn't look at that person and say, well, they had a great life. Because maybe they had a good beginning, but they had a really terrible ending. Yeah. So it was this kind of thing you said about a totality. It was the kind of thing you said about a life overall. It was also the kind of thing, and this is important, that because it's not a subjective feeling, it was the kind of things that other people could say about you. And you couldn't, so there's almost this way of saying, like, if you think of it as subjective, you could say, well, I know things are going terrible, but I'm happy. And if happiness is subjective, who are we to disagree? But when happiness is it's this objective thing, people can look at you and say, no, you don't have a happy life because you don't meet these criteria, right? It's like if you think of a Stoic example, you might think of someone who's immoral, and they have a lot of money, or they have a lot of vices that they indulge in, and they say, well, screw you, Stoics. Like, I'm happy even though I'm doing things you disagree with. And the Stoics and would want to say that we're able to say, no, you're not. Like, we're able to say that about other people based on whether or not they meet these objective criteria. Yeah. So I like to think of it, I say happiness as like an introduction to the term, but I think a lot of the confusion goes away if you say a good life, Yeah. That person had a good life. And that's what we're asking the question of, what does a good life look like? And what is required for it and what is not required for it?
I'm really interested in the part of the definition that has to do with the kind of guiding spirit, right? Because that's... Yeah, what does that even mean? Is that like this source of rationality? Is that their version of God back then? Is it like what is that guiding spirit? Because it almost seems like it could be like the logos, which is what we're aiming at with Stoicism, right? Like that guiding truth essentially that you can tap into at any time. But I don't know. What do you think?
So a daimon is like it's like a demigod, so it's not quite God. And the reason the Stoics are using that term is they're just following Aristotle, right? So Aristotle's using that term because that's the term that normal people use. Yeah. And then everybody else follows with that term. Yeah. But it's just like it would just be like it's not the spirit of the universe. It's not God. It's just some. I mean, I don't know. I wouldn't want to think of a ghost in that sense, but it's just it's an individualized spirit that is watching over you, and they're individualized in this sense. So there's as many as there are people, and so daimon, you could use this kind of interchangeably with luck. So to have a good daimon was to have good luck, and it was this kind of explanation for why things fared well for you. This outside of a philosophical context, it was kind of an explanation. Well, things went well for me. It was because I had a good spirit. Like I had a eudaimon, making sure that luck turned out well for me. Yeah. And that was kind of used in a non-philosophical concept as the term. And then Aristotle and then the Stoics adopt it and turn it fleshed out into a full philosophical concept.
So could you almost say that it's could you almost liken it to, say, something good happens to me and I say, oh, thank God, it's like, oh, thank that little thing that's like watching over me from time to time, that means my life is good, that little fate,
Similar to this, but it would be individualized, right? So if we say thank God in a Christian context, we think it's one God looking over all of us, but it's individualized. It's your daimon. Yeah. Right.
But see, what's interesting is what's interesting about the people who say, "Oh, thank God." Not everybody who says, "Oh, thank God," is a Christian or even believes in a God. Right? It's just it's just something we say in Western culture. And if you don't believe in God, then what are you saying? So it's like, okay, well, thank whatever is working towards, like, not that anything is necessarily working necessarily, but it's like, thank whatever has just happened because I don't have to feel pain now. Okay, cool. I think that's an interesting way.
An expression of appreciation, for the way things are turning out, and a recognition that you're like not fully aware of why they turned out that way. Like something seems to be going on beyond your grasp, but it kind of it worked out anyway. Just thank God for that.
Yeah. Okay, cool. So that kind of speaks to the Stoic view of potentially speaks to the Stoic view of love your fate. It's like, look, things are going to happen, good or bad. Accept the good and the bad, deal with it. So okay, cool. So we know how they kind of defined eudaimonia or happiness. Now, how do we get to Hellenistic philosophy now? And like, what are the main? Oh, actually, when did Hellenistic philosophy first kind of emerge?
Oh boy, so my timing here would have to be specific. It would be post Aristotle, so it'd be around 300 BC.
Cool. Yeah.
And then we're looking to around 300 AD. So what happens is a lot of these ideas kind of get consumed by Christianity, and some of them get thrown away and some of them get incorporated. Okay. So around 300 BC, 300 AD.
Yeah. Awesome. And so who leads the charge on Hellenistic philosophy? And are we in Athens right now? Is this the main hub of Hellenistic philosophy?
Yeah. So Hellenistic philosophy, this is just the word for Greek in Greek. Okay. Okay. So it's just that's what Hellenistic is. It's Greek.
Yeah.
So it's kind of Greek philosophy, but it's acquired its own term. So if you say Greek philosophy, it's ambiguous. Do you mean Plato? Do you mean Socrates? Who do you mean? So it's the Greek philosophy that emerged after Aristotle.
Yeah, great.
And that's the term we're giving to it.
Yeah.
And Hellenistic philosophy, this is a term we've given afterwards. But the main players, it's so cool. So Aristotle does this innovative work, and then people start running with it in different directions. So the main players, I would say there's 5. And this is a lot, but we can see which ones we want to talk about.
Yeah,
there's
definitely.
Cynicism.
Yep.
So there's Cynicism, there's Stoicism, there's Skepticism, there's Epicureanism, and then there's the Peripatetics. And the Peripatetics are the Aristotelians. They're the followers of Aristotle. So those are the five main players, and all of them have a different answer to this question of the content of a good life.
Now, could you just repeat for me that last one? So we've got cynicism, stoicism, skepticism, epicureanism, and the last one there.
It's the so P-E-R-I, patetics.
Yeah. Peripatetics. Okay, awesome. Okay, cool. So it seems to me like the most influential in that group were probably like the Cynics, the Stoics, and the Epicureans, right? Because I haven't heard a lot about like the Skeptics. I haven't. Yeah, I've heard a lot about the Skeptics, but who do you think actually who led the charge? Like, who was the first one out of the bat in terms of like these philosophies? Do you know, or is it even important?
So I'm not sure chronologically exactly.
Mm,
What I know is that pre-Stoicism, you had Cynicism and Epicureanism.
yeah.
So Stoicism actually comes from Cynicism.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So Zeno of Citium, the founder of Stoicism, he was a student of Diogenes. He was a student of a Cynic. So
Yeah.
pre-Stoicism, I know you had Cynicism and Epicureanism.
Yeah.
So those two were kind of originating this kind of way of formulating it. One of the reasons you don't hear a lot about the skeptics is, I mean, we can talk about that more, but it's just because they didn't really have people. People want an answer, right? Mm-hmm. And the people are searching for this truth. And the skeptic position was that we should refrain from false judgments. Yeah. So it says, look, we don't know, so we shouldn't. It's better to. It's like agnosticism, right?
Yeah, yeah.
It's better to not know, admit you don't know, than to believe the wrong thing. And they would the skeptics would kind of point to like, look, the Christians don't know. They wouldn't talk about this in this way, but in a modern context, they would say, look, the religious people don't know. But the atheists don't know either. You don't know. You don't know anyway. You have to be agnostic about it. And so that was a position, but it's just not one that's very. I don't think it's very inspiring in the same way reading about Stoicism or Epicureanism or Cynicism can be, because it was kind of like it was a stepping away from the debates.
Yeah, and it's interesting because that doesn't necessarily mean that there's not a ton of value to derive from that philosophy. It just means that Stoicism is probably a little bit more popular because it actually gives people some answers, right? It gives them something to believe that could help them, right? Okay, cool. So we know that skepticism was like, you don't know what the real answer is, so why would you make a judgment about it? Can we move through each of the main Hellenistic philosophies, leaving Stoicism to the end, and then maybe go through how Stoicism fits in there and is influenced by the others or influenced the others, if that's a question that makes sense.
Yeah, great. Let me try this. This is a bit of a challenge.
Yeah, this is going to be good.
So the question is...
No, I don't expect you to know absolutely everything. So if you don't know something, it doesn't matter. We can move on. But yeah, it'd be fun exercise anyway. Best.
So the question is, what constitutes a good life? Okay, so what kind of things do you have to have a good life?
Yeah.
So the Aristotelians, the Peripatetics, are going to say that a good life is a combination of certain external goods and virtue, right? So you have to be a good person, but if you're a good person and you're like locked in a basement somewhere getting tortured, it's like, sorry, if we had to evaluate that life, it was a bad life.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
So you have to you're a good person, but things also go well for you externally. And Aristotle talks about this. Aristotle says, look, like if you're rich, you can be an even better person because you can donate your money and you can start, you can think of this like a philanthropist. You get the most opportunity to be a good person if things are going well for you. So for the Peripatetics, it was virtue plus a certain amount of external goods.
Yeah.
For the Epicureans, what constitutes a good life is pleasure. Okay? So a good life is one of maximum pleasure, minimal pain, both physically and emotionally. Physically, you do this by living very simply. Okay? So they thought what we need to have physical pleasure is very little. We need a little bit of food and a little bit of water. So you achieve physical pleasure by living very simply. And they would say any physical pain, if it's long, it's bearable. But if it's very bad, it's short. You'll die soon anyway. So that's how you don't have to worry about physical pain that much. If you live simply in this sense, and then emotionally, you achieve pleasure by cultivating virtue. So they thought that good people, experienced the best emotional lives, right? They felt the best about what they were doing, about how they were helping others, about their friendships. So the Epicureans thought virtue was necessary, but it was not the good. The good was pleasure, and you used virtue to get to it. Okay, so the Peripatetics, two goods, right? Virtue and external goods. The Epicureans, only one good, pleasure, but you achieve pleasure by being virtuous.
Yeah, because I think a lot of people misinterpret that, right? Like, I think even myself included a lot. Like, you think about the Epicureans and you think all they wanted was pleasure. So it was almost bordering on the hedonistic kind of lifestyle, right? It's like, I'll just have whatever I want, but that's really not what they were saying, essentially.
Well, the confusion here is that it is hedonistic, right? Hedon is the Greek word for pleasure. It was hedonistic, but it was hedonistic in the Greek sense, not hedonistic in our sense, in the modern sense.
Okay, cool.
And there was this argument. The Epicureans just think that if you pursue pleasure, you harm your friends to get pleasurable things, you're going to feel really guilty.
Yeah.
And your goal for pleasure is both physical pleasure, but also mental pleasure, right? Yeah. So if you're a terrible person, they just thought it was a fact of our nature that you're going to feel awful about it. And then you're not going to have a pleasurable life. They say the people who feel the best about themselves are good people.
Yeah.
So it was this pursuit of pleasure, but it was this recognition that you needed to be a good person to maximize this pleasure.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, I love it. Yeah, this is just bringing a lot of clarity to all of these different branches of Hellenistic philosophy, and I think it's really good for us to continue to go through. So I think we've just got to touch on cynicism now, but then it'd be really good to see how Stoicism fits within this kind of landscape.
Great.
I'll let you continue.
I'll start with skepticism, if that's okay. Because skepticism
sorry, we haven't done that yet. Yep.
No, but they also had a more robust ethical position. And the ethical position was like, what causes suffering, right? What causes suffering is when we're attached to things. Yeah. We think, things are going to turn out this way, and they don't. Or we think it's good if things turn out this way and they don't. I remember this, I can't remember if it's Zen or Buddhist, and it's this idea. And, this guy, I'm trying to remember, it's a farmer. I'm not sure if you've heard this story before. And his horse runs away, and somebody says, "Oh, I'm so sorry, your horse ran away." And he's like they're like, "That's bad." And he's like, "Maybe it is, maybe it isn't." And then the horse comes back, and it brought a new horse, and they're like, "Wow, you have another horse. That's amazing." He goes, "Maybe it's good, maybe it isn't." And then his son's riding on the horse that got brought back, falls off, he breaks his leg. They're like, "That's terrible." He goes, "Maybe it is, maybe it isn't." And then there's a conscription for the war, and the son doesn't get conscripted because he has a broken leg. And they go, "Well, that's amazing." And he goes, "Maybe it is, maybe it isn't."
Yeah.
And that's the skeptic position, right? Is you kind of float in this middle ground, and you don't have these ups and downs that cause from being attached to, like, wow, this is really good. Wow, this is really bad. Oh, my life goes well if that happens. My life goes bad if that happens. They would look at people doing Hellenistic philosophy, and they'd be like, "You're just putting yourself in for a world of hurt because you don't know the answer to this question, but you're going to attach yourself to one of these answers." And so this is interesting when we go to Stoicism, because Stoicism and Skepticism are very similar, because Skepticism and Stoicism both say, don't believe something unless you know it's true. They both think that, because Stoics are going to say the big cause of our suffering is false judgments.
Yeah.
And then the skeptics are going to say, and you can't know what's true. But then the Stoics are going to say, no, you can know something is true. So Stoicism has a default skeptical position that you then use theory to work your way carefully out of. But default Stoicism has a lot in common with skepticism. So that's really there's a connection there that's really interesting.
Yeah, I'm seeing connections between all of these philosophies, really. And it almost I don't want to say that Stoicism is like it's almost like it seems to be like kind of the best of, let's take the best, but because I don't want to say that because it kind of downgrades the other philosophies, but it's interesting to see how it's influenced by every other philosophy, really.
They were arguing with each other. They were debating. They would meet in the streets, and they would argue about these things. So there's if there was something good, one of the schools incorporated. They're like, oh, I never thought about that, but that, that has a lot of value, and they would incorporate it. So perhaps Stoicism has the most incorporation, if we want to make that claim, because the Stoics were so committed to truth in this sense. They were willing to incorporate the pieces of value from everything else.
Yeah.
I think historically, if we wanted to make a claim for that, we probably could, because Stoicism has this commitment to truth and living in accordance with the way things are.
Yeah.
So that would be a reason for them to incorporate the valid points of the other schools.
Definitely.
And then we get Cynicism. So Cynicism is very close to Stoicism. Stoicism is a branch of Cynicism. It's an offshoot.
Yeah.
Cynicism says what is good in a good life is one that's lived in accordance with nature, which sounds very familiar. If you know any Stoicism, that's also what a good life is for Stoicism.
Yeah.
They just think what a life in accordance with nature is different. So for them, society corrupts us. Society makes us ignorant. It harms us. So the ideal Stoic was the one who was able to break away from society. And you hear these crazy stories about Diogenes, and he would live in a barrel, and he would urinate and defecate in public, and it was just this demonstration of he just didn't care about societal norms. He was just living in accordance to what he took his nature to be. And cynicism comes from the Greek word for dog. So he was living like a dog, was the idea, like separated from society in this way. And that's the Cynic ideal. It's a very harsh philosophy. So they were very into very harsh physical training to unlearn these things that society has taught you and the ways that society has corrupted you. And then we get to Stoicism. I mean, I don't know, do we want to talk about that at all, or how's?
No, I think that's interesting, but you have to confirm some stories for me, because I've heard some great stories about Diogenes. Is it true that he would walk around during the daytime with a lamp, and when people would ask him, what are you doing, he'd be saying, I'm searching for an honest man, like just the ultimate troll?
It is this troll. So we have this kind of story. We have a story where, and I mean, these are as true as we can take. They're at least reported of him, right? I hope they are. There's one where Alexander the Great admires him, and he comes up to him and he goes, like Diogenes is sitting on the ground, and Alexander the Great standing in front of him. And he says, Diogenes, like, tell me what I can do for you. If I can do anything in this world, I'll do it. Diogenes is like, you can get out of my light. Like, you can get out of the way because you're blocking the sun. There's one with Diogenes where he's all he has, his only earthly possession is this little cup. And he goes down to the river, and he's filling up water in this cup and drinking from it. And he sees this young boy cupping his hands and drinking out of his hands. And Diogenes just like throws his cup away in anger and is like, man, even this kid is a better philosopher than me, because like he doesn't even need a cup. But there was this trolling to cynicism of trying to shock people out of their comfort zone and out of this, because they saw society as this corrupting force, right? As this force that caused you to be ignorant, and you thought what it was according to your nature was to sleep in a home and to have 3 meals a day and to care about what other people think of you. And you think that's your nature because it feels right when you grow up being socialized in this way.
Yeah.
So there was this attempt to shock people out of it. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I love that. I just love those stories, because it's just so hilarious to think that he would go down with a cup and then see somebody else drinking from their hands and like, damn it, now I can't even use a cup. It's just like, oh man, like, but when you think about it, like, man, that is a difficult life to live. That's extremely difficult. And for us to even consider giving up our apartment, giving up, all the security, giving up your job, everything, even down to a cup, like that's an extreme form of human strength if you really think about it. And it's extremely inspiring as well. Like, I can see why people like Alexander the Great would have gone to Diogenes to find out what it is that allows him to get to that stage of just being so open about being on the street like that, right?
And that's the origins of Stoicism, right? The origins of Stoicism is kind of the rejection of common values.
Yeah.
Is kind of looking at common values and saying there's something wrong here.
But you don't have to
And
live on the street to be a Stoic.
yeah, and I'll get to that point.
Yeah.
Because that's worth developing, the difference there. But some people like Epictetus, who's the Stoic that I worked most with, he looks at Diogenes as the ideal. The two people that he talks about the most and references the most is Diogenes the Cynic, the one, the stories we were talking about, and Socrates. Both of these people were people who threw away social convention, were considered trolls in the modern sense, but not trolls in the sense of intentionally aggravating, but there was an educational value, right? Socrates thought himself as a gadfly whose goal was to bug you out of your, out of your mundane, unexamined existence. So Socrates or Epictetus idealizes these people. He thinks that cynicism, Epictetus does, not all Stoics, but Epictetus thinks that cynicism is the highest calling. It's the thing that not everyone can do. It's better than being a Stoic. He's like, it's Stoicism plus, right? He's like, not everybody possesses the strength to go that far. So we're just going to do Stoicism, because if you're a cynic, that's your entire life. One of the nice things about Stoicism, it's something that you can implement into your life. Cynicism, you can't implement into your life. It's a rejection of your life.
Yeah.
So it's interesting.
I love it.
I don't know. Do you want me to get to Stoicism now?
Yeah, let's jump into Stoicism. So, and we can even continue on that idea that, okay, maybe Stoicism is a philosophy that is, it's built for the masses, or not for the masses. I don't want to say that, because there's also the interpretation that maybe Stoicism is something that is only meant for a smaller, tight community of people on Earth who are able to help others. But I see it as something that should be brought to the masses, because it has such value if you implement it into your life, right? Did it start off as that? Like, is that what they were trying to do? Make it easier for people to kind of get in the game?
Yeah. So I'll start with the difference between Stoicism and cynicism.
Yeah.
Right. So cynicism thinks that life is according to a good life is a life according to nature. But your nature is almost like this pursuit of just virtue at the expense of everything else. And then Stoicism thought that good life was a life in accordance with nature, but your nature was as a rational social animal. Right? So there's this social aspect that's built into Stoicism that's not built into cynicism, where a good Stoic is one who lives according to their nature, but they respect their nature as someone who wants to be part of a community, who wants to have friends and a family, who wants to see political and social change and progress and these kind of things. So this was the break. It's more inclusive because it incorporates this social aspect. It doesn't see the socialization as being necessarily corrupting or harmful, and that's the big break. Now, in terms of the question of is Stoicism for the masses, absolutely, right? Stoicism was the first cosmopolitan philosophy, so it was the first philosophy. I mean, there's lines in Seneca where Seneca says, like, who is this person? And someone goes, he's a slave. And go, wrong, he's a human being first. Yeah. Right? There's this incredible equality that flows through Stoicism, because Stoics saw us fundamentally as rational beings. Yeah. That is what we essentially are, and that's the most important part of our identity. And that identity is shared by all human beings. So Stoicism is not for an elite few. I would say the Stoics would consider life as a philosopher for a select few.
And it's even like select might not even be the right term there. It's like the life of a philosopher is for those who can handle it, right? Like and maybe like Stoicism is for people who just need a little bit of help in their life, just to become better at whatever they're doing.
Yeah, so the way Epictetus talks about this is Epictetus says, honestly evaluate who you are, what you like to do, what you're good at. I mean, there's this idea with God there, but we don't need God. But he says, like, God gave you certain talents. Yeah. Did he make you good socially? Did he make you, are you strong? Are you good at sports? Are you, are you artistically talented? Look at the skills God gave you, and then do those to the best of your ability. And then the second part is like, some people, God gave them just the disposition to do just philosophy. Yeah. And those people, great, they should do just philosophy. But for most people, you should do what you are inclined towards and what you discover you have kind of a talent or an affinity for. So in that sense, yeah, it's for a select few. And I suppose those few are lucky in a sense, but it's not like the other ones are weak, right? Yeah. If you don't want to do philosophy because you don't want to read all day, you like having a social job or being part of something else like that. That doesn't make you weak. It just means that you have a different disposition and a different affinity that you develop, right? And in that sense, you still incorporate Stoicism. You're not failing by not being a professional philosopher, right?
Yeah, this is really interesting because this is incorporating so many of the things that I've been thinking about a lot lately. It's this idea of Stoic. Well, let me start like this. This idea of aligning with nature, right? Just the fact that the Cynics thought differently about that than the Stoics. I've really been thinking lately, to get your head around that idea, there are so many offshoots of directions that you can go of live your life according to nature, right? There's so many different ways that you could live your life according to nature. And you're touching on one that I've been really thinking about lately, which is when you're born, some people just grow up and they are naturally inclined towards a certain direction, right? And is it right to fight that? Or maybe what's happening in our modern society is because of the, industrial revolution and the technological revolution, it's like we get into these 9-to-5 jobs doing something that's just going to bring in the money, and you see so many people who at the end of their life, they're like, oh, I really wish I had have done that, or I really wish I had have done that. And what that is I should have aligned with my true nature of what I was inclined towards, right? So for me, naturally, I have a talent for music, right? Now, that's good because it allows me to progress a little bit faster, but it's also bad because if I don't work at it, then I just stay at the same spot, right? Like I don't feel like I need to work towards it when I really do. That would be the best thing for me. But what I've come to lately is, man, I need to incorporate music into my life. I need to incorporate everything that I really love to do and figure out how I can live in this world whilst doing those things, because that's what aligning with nature is, right? It's like, what are the things that I'm drawn to?
Yeah, great. So this is such an interesting question. I really like Epictetus, so I turn to Epictetus in terms of these. So the question is, look, live in accordance with nature. What does that mean? Also, there's different natures. There's outside nature, but then there's our nature. And Epictetus provides a hierarchy on kind of like 3 levels.
Yeah, let's talk about this.
Yeah, it's really cool. So there is nature as in like fate, right? So don't fight like the physical world. Yeah. So he even says this, like, if I knew I was destined to die, I would like accept death. Yeah. Right. And we can think of this in extreme cases, but it's like if you have a terminal illness, the Stoics would think your job then is to make the best use of the time you have. It's not to fight this illness because you're fighting against your fate in this sense. And then we have our shared nature as rational beings. So first thing we do is we don't fight against fate. And then we never compromise our nature as rational beings. And what that means is we never put something above virtue. So if I pursued some sort of like physical pleasure at the risk of compromising virtue, then they would think you're acting more like an animal than a rational being. You're not living in accordance with your nature as a rational being. And then once those 2 questions are aside, you're not being a bad person, you've come to terms with your fate, then it's like you have so many other choices now, how you live. And for there, Epictetus says we need to look to our individual nature. So our affinities and our dispositions, as you talked about, your disposition to singing or to music, your affinity for these things. And then the last thing we can turn to is our acquired roles. Talk about them as social roles.
Yeah.
So then the next thing we do is we consider, what is my nature, the nature of my relationship with other people if I'm a father or a son or a brother or a member of a community. And it's through reference to these kind of things. If we act in a way that satisfies these conditions, that's living in accordance with nature. And the Stoics think your life's going to go really, really well if you're not sacrificing or compromising any of those. Yeah. So I think that's a cool way of fleshing out nature further.
Yeah, and exactly what I was saying. It's like there's so many different things to think about, and that's why in the past it's been really difficult for me to fully grasp this idea of align with nature, because it's not just here's what it is. It's like here's what it is plus this plus this plus this, right? And what I think is really interesting is how this idea has left ripples throughout Western culture. So, for example, even just the fact that you think of people as, well, they have a good nature and a bad nature, right? Like he acted in his best nature, like and it's almost as if like there's kind of a chaotic part of our nature and an orderly part of our nature, and we try to tend towards that good nature, right? I said nature way too many times there. But then even when people say, it's just not in my nature to do this, like we don't think of that as I'm aligning with nature, but that's what aligning with nature is. You think it's just not within my nature to be an accountant, or to be a musician. I have no tendency towards that, right? So it's cool how it has left ripples, but in terms of the fate side of things. Is that essentially saying things that are happening to us, right? Is that like coming to terms with just whatever happens, as in it's going to happen and you have to be able to accept that, right?
Yeah, so there's still room. So fate is like this really difficult issue in Stoicism. They were determinists. So that means that they think that life is fated to occur in a certain way, and they had this kind of, when people hear this, they kind of think, well, if it's what's the point in doing anything, right? If it's deterministic, things are going to happen the way they're going to happen. And there's entire Stoic books arguing against this, that knowing things are fated doesn't give us a reason to not still be motivated. And that's an interesting question. But in terms of this, we have to understand that we stand in a certain knowledge position, a flawed knowledge position, where we don't know what's going to happen to us, right? So the answer is, if I knew what was going to happen to me, and that's why I tried to use the example of a terminal illness where you're going to die. But if I knew, or for example, we know we're going to die. We don't know when, but we know we're going to die.
Yeah.
So anything that you know is going to happen to you, you have to come to terms with.
Yeah.
Right? And acknowledge this and not fight against this. Everything else, we still have a capacity to attempt to influence it and navigate that. But once we have failed to influence it, so I try to stop something from happening, but then it happens. Now it has happened. Now it's a part of the things that have happened to me. I no longer have that capacity to influence it, and then that becomes part of, I know that was my fate now. I know that was what was going to happen to me, and then I have to come to terms with it. So the idea is, come to terms with what you know must be the case. That means everything in your past and certain things in the future, like the fact that you're going to die, like the fact that some people are ignorant and ignorant people are going to do ignorant, harmful, mean things. Like the fact that you're not going to be perfect and sometimes you're going to fail in the future. Certain things are going to happen, you have to come to terms with. Just to put yourself in line with that nature, with those facts of the world. But this is it. It's like if we knew what we were going to do, we could just be like, oh, if we knew what was going to happen, we could come to peace with it. But because we don't know, we're still trying our best to influence it. But once we know how it's going to happen or what has happened, then we come to terms with that fact of the world.
Yeah, I love it. So it's kind of breaking it down into two knowledges. It's a knowledge of what will definitely happen, right? So you have to come to terms with that. And it's a knowledge of the things that have happened that are now outside of your control, right? And so you wouldn't tell somebody, well, you shouldn't set goals for the future because, because you can't control your fate. Like, yeah, set goals, but along the way to achieving them, you need to accept what happens and navigate around it, right? So in that sense, yeah, it's deterministic, but it's also, it leaves room for exploration and for at least some set of direction, right?
Yeah, well, we're kind of seeing this life unfold, right? Because the Stoics are materialists. They think everything is matter, and matter follows physical rules. So matter is just interacting with each other, and it's going to and if we knew how to predict matter, we could predict what would happen.
Yeah.
But we're not perfect at that yet, so we can't predict. But we're kind of participating in a discovery of our own fate. We're kind of participating in seeing how things turn out. I don't find that demotivating at all. And it certainly doesn't discourage you. It doesn't discourage you from trying, right? Because perhaps your fate was to try really hard and succeed. Perhaps your fate was to try really hard and fail. Neither of those two, the fact that one of those is going to occur because matter is just interacting in a certain way, shouldn't prevent you from, setting yourself towards the preferable one. It's just not thinking, if we're setting goals, it's just not thinking that my life only goes well if that goal is achieved. Yeah. Right?
Yeah.
Your life goes well if you adapt in accordance with what is occurring. If you're living in accordance with that nature, your life doesn't go well just by achieving those goals.
Yeah.
But then part of your nature is as a goal-setting animal or creature. So you're denying something very human if you entirely suppress these kind of intuitions or aims.
Yeah. No, I love that. And I before I forget about it, I have to duck back to something that you said earlier, and then maybe once we've answered this, we'll wrap it up with some sort of an explanation of a few of the other ways that Stoicism has taken from the other Hellenistic philosophies or added to them, right?
Sure.
But I wanted you to define what you meant by, or not what you meant, but what the Stoics meant and what the Hellenistic philosophers meant by God, right? Because it's not the same as in our Western culture today of Christianity. It's not the same God, right? It's. Do you know what they kind of defined it at, or what the original word was?
So the original word is theos, which is where we get theology.
Okay.
So theology is the study of theos. It's the study of God or gods. So this is the difference between theos and daimon. Daimon is these kind of spirits, and theos is God. Now, this Hellenistic theology is a whole different, that's a whole different ball game. But I can give you some pictures. The Epicurean picture of God, I know this, was one in which God was very uninvolved. It didn't concern itself too much with our fates, and along these lines. So the Epicureans thought, because in contemporary Greek society, you had very much this idea of Christianity kind of takes this on with saints. You had different gods that filled different roles, right? You think of all these different Greek gods, would be the god of war, the god of commerce, the god of travel, the god of partying. And you'd kind of look for blessings from that god if you wanted to fare well in one of these. And the Epicureans thought that caused us a lot of stress and a lot of suffering, because they were constantly sacrificing to the gods and thinking, the gods have cursed me or are looking down on me. And the Epicureans kind of took this position of the gods are not really that concerned with your fate. Perfect beings aren't going to be, mad at you. So that was a way to kind of reduce a lot of the emotional stress they thought regular Greek people felt with this obsession with making the gods happy. So Epicureans had this really removed conception of God. Um, and then for the Stoics, we get a God that looks almost Christian, but we have to be careful. So with the Greeks, we had many different gods, each for different reasons, right? Zeus, or Poseidon, or things like this. And so for the Stoics, you had one God, or something in which they refer to as God. Now, you want to be careful. So in Christianity, this God is anthropomorphized. So this God has a specific kind of will, and can become angry, and can punish, and so on and so forth, and can have a child, can have a son. In Stoicism, God was identified with reason, with the divine principle that inhabited all things and caused motion and order and structure. So they thought they were materialistic, so everything was matter, even God was matter. This is an important distinction from Christianity. But if you just had matter, matter is inert. So you need some sort of principle that gives it motion, gives it structure and form. And for them, they thought that this inert matter was combined with this divine principle everywhere. So there's divine principle in every. And what that divine principle does is it maintains the form of that thing. So there's a little bit of logos or intelligence or divinity in a rock, and that's what keeps a rock shape. That's what stops it from falling apart and disintegrating. Yeah. There's divinity of a different form. So there's the divinity of the same form, of a little bit different form in plants, and that's what causes them to grow. So a rock is just the same. You have a different type of divinity in plants that causes them to grow. And then you have an even more refined type of divinity in animals, and that gives them a basic type of intelligence. And then you have the highest type of divinity, self-reflective intelligence, only in humans. So humans have, Epictetus talks about this all the time, we have a piece of God within us. Our self-reflective capacity is the highest form of divine intelligence. So just to summarize with that, in the Stoic God, there's one, but it doesn't stand outside the world. It permeates everything.
Yeah.
It provides motion and form. It gives everything the structure and form that it has. And then it takes different forms. It takes forms in rocks, plants, animals, and then it takes its highest form in humans. So it's a very different understanding of God. It's very interesting. And that's why for them, living in accordance with nature, God was nature, right? Yeah. So it's living in accordance with God. Because God doesn't stand outside it. He's not transcendental, is the term people would use.
Yeah, I love that. I think that's giving me a lot, and hopefully the listeners as well, like a lot of clarity on the way that the Stoics saw, that kind of metaphysical side of what we all try to think about, right? And that's a really great definition of, like, it's not outside of us and it's not outside of the world. It is a part of everything, right?
Yes.
And whether you believe that or not, it's like it's also interesting for me. Like, I always try to look at nature and see what I can learn about myself as a result of looking at the patterns in nature, right? And if you think about it like that, people always talk about how, like, cities in some ways mimic nature, and how if you look at the humanity as a whole and how it moves around and fights and then makes peace and everything, it's like, man, like, we are so much more a part of nature than what anybody really understands, right? And we're only just starting to fully understand that.
Well, I might be going a bit outside my depth here, but you get this idea of Christianity, you get this Christian idea of us being and not to say this is the only way you could take Christianity, but there's a way of looking at Christianity of saying, like, look, we're different from everything else. There's God, and then there's us in God's image, and then there's the rest of the world, which was made to benefit us or to serve us. And for the Stoics, it's like God is in everything, and we are just different manifestations of that energy. Some of it is more complex and more intelligent and more reasonable, like our minds are more complex than in animals or something along these lines, but we're all filled with the same principle and the same form. I guess I suppose you get the Holy Spirit in Christianity to kind of take up that space, but I think a lot of the differences come from this kind of Christian influence, because Stoicism was pre-Christianity, and that's why it can really be counterintuitive in a lot of these ways. I mean, we were talking we were talking about nature that goes against my nature and things like this. And you think of Christianity kind of brings in this picture of us having a sinful nature. So us having a nature that is flawed, that we're trying to repent for and do our best, but we'll never succeed, right? Whereas Stoicism doesn't have that. We're not essentially sinful in nature. We're essentially rational in nature. So the Stoics look at us like we're sick. We have a disease. They use this metaphor all the time. We have to cure the disease. But healthy us is just normal us.
Yeah.
So it's a real paradigm shift when you're doing Hellenistic philosophy, because most moral education, I think, comes from Judeo-Christian values. So now we're getting this moral education that is certainly, they certainly have influenced one another, but they're separate also. It's interesting.
Yeah, no, it is really interesting. I just really appreciate you talking about this so much, because we started with Hellenistic philosophy, now we've made our way all the way down to the definition of Stoic God, you know, and I think it's just one of those areas that people tend to gloss over it really quickly. It's like, well, they talked about God, but we don't need to focus on that because God's not real. It's like, well, hang on, like this could be a really important aspect of the philosophy that helps us to understand even more about like how it can help us, right? Like it could have been extremely important that the Stoics even talked about this, right? So, I really appreciate that. But okay, getting back into to the connections, is there anything else you want to say about how Stoicism is connected through the other philosophies in Hellenism?
So one thing that I want to think that when I see most people engaging in modern Stoicism, I think the biggest mistake I see is most people are actually Epicureans. So maybe not most, but a lot of people. A lot of people say, look, a good life is to be happy, which they mean to feel good. They say, I want to feel good. Stoicism makes me feel good. There's nothing wrong with this, but just you'll serve yourself a lot better if you recognize that you're an Epicurean. You think that a good life is one of pleasure. It's one of reduced mental suffering, and you see Stoicism as the way to achieve that. There's nothing wrong with that, but I would love to see more people make that distinction. Ask yourself what comes first. Does pleasure come first, or does virtue come first? Yeah. Right? And if are you practicing Stoicism because it makes you feel good, or because you want to be a good person? And those are separate. They're interrelated, but those are separate ends. And I think the modern Stoics would be helped by pulling those apart a little further. And then other things in terms of influence, I talked about the influence between skepticism and Stoicism. Skepticism and Stoicism are the exact same in terms of we should not believe something unless we know it to be true. The skeptics just go, we can't know anything to be true, so forget it. And the Stoics go, well, we can know some things to be true, and we can move cautiously from those principles. Like we can know, virtue is good. We can know vice is bad. We can move cautiously from there. So those things are not as different as you might suspect. And I think a kind of default Stoic position for those just beginning, most Stoics that are beginning should be more skeptical. Epictetus says, when he talks about the progress of a Stoic, he says, you should actually become agnostic about what is good and bad. If you try to navigate Stoicism with your current commitments, you're going to fail. You have to take a step back and say, okay, I totally forget everything I think about what's good and bad, and then you kind of reevaluate your life and recategorize. So there's that. I think there's more skepticism in Stoicism than people acknowledge. The other thing is between Aristotelianism or the Peripatetics and Stoicism comes down to what you think your essential nature is. So do you think your essential nature is of a rational being, or do you think you are an intelligent animal who also has physical needs and physical desires that need to be satisfied in order to live well? This is Cicero's objection in the book On Ends. He argues against Stoicism on this place. He goes, look, Stoicism, I totally get your argument, but why are you identifying yourself as just a rational animal? Why not all of these parts of your identity? Why not identify yourself with your physical body as well, and recognize that if I don't have enough food to eat or I don't have shelter, I'm being harmed? Why just this reduction to your choice in your mind? So I think people need to people could be served better by thinking about that question. What do they think they essentially are? Do they think they're essentially their choosing capacity, their mind, their reason? Or do they think they're an animal that is also very intelligent, and thus a good life has to satisfy both aspects of being? That I think is a really good way. That's my best attempt to frame this interaction in Hellenistic philosophy and Stoicism.
Yeah, I love it. And honestly, there's like so many more questions that we could get into, but I think that what you've done is give us a really, really good overview of how Stoics, like I'm very, very excited about this episode because it just clarifies so much for me. And I know that if it clarifies a lot for me, it's going to clarify a lot for the listeners. And I think that you make a good point there, like really trying to think about which school you currently fit into, aside from the fact that you say, oh, I'm a Stoic, or like I live a Stoic lifestyle. Really take a look at each of these philosophies and you might actually fit into another one, even better. And yeah, as I said, there's so much more that I want to talk about. I'm going to have to end it here because I think this is a really good place to end the episode. And Michael, Great. We're going to have many, many, many more conversations because this has just been an absolute pleasure. Like your knowledge is really, like, I'm really grateful for it. So thanks so much for coming on.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's always a pleasure.
Yeah, definitely. And I'll provide links to where everyone can find you. I know we were going to talk about your Brazilian jiu-jitsu as well, but we can save that for another time as well. But
great.
Is there anything else that you want to share with the audience before we head off?
Yeah, so like I might have mentioned this last time, I think, but this helpfully applies here is Marcus Aurelius talks about how it's the truth he's after. If you can show he's wrong, he'll gladly accept it. And just living an examined life is so valuable. Anybody watching this podcast or watching this video and engaging in these questions, I'm so happy because we're all so much better off for being examined and being intentional. And I don't really think there's a right answer in that sense. At least not a right answer that's easily come by. It's not like any of these schools are right and the other ones are wrong, obviously. But just engaging in this process of intentional living is so valuable. But if you came to this process through Stoicism, I love Stoicism. I think I fall in the Stoic camp. But don't become a dogmatic party follower. As you talked about, take your time to dip your toes, and at the very least, just like Stoicism took something of value from those other schools, maybe you're still a Stoic, but you take something of value from them too, right?
Yeah, as all of the Stoics have done, as Seneca did. He would often quote, Epictetus and say, look, just because they're outside of our philosophy doesn't mean that we shouldn't learn from them. Like, it's almost as if we should actively be trying to see what they're saying, as if we're kind of watching the enemy. It's like, okay, what are they doing? Oh, it's kind of like, okay, I'm going to take that because that's really good, but I'm going to leave the rest, So yeah, there's definitely, I really like that. And I think that's important for people to know that you don't have to jump into this and be like, I'm a Stoic, I'm going to do that. And, I've done that a lot in the past, and I'm trying to get away from that. I'm trying to look at this as just a set of really valuable tools, if they work, that I can use in my life. So awesome. Michael, thank you so much for coming on. All right, so there you have it, my interview with Michael Tremblay. And guys, I'm going to put all of the links to where you can find Michael online in the show notes. And as I always say, make sure you reach out to Michael and, share with him how much value he gave you in this interview, and let him know how much you appreciate him spending his time with us to come on here and share all this information. And do that with all of the guests, because it's such a privilege that we get to have them on this show and listen to them and really pick their brain even just for an hour. But Michael, absolutely loved that conversation. I want to have many, many more. Thank you so much. And everybody, I'll talk to you next time. But until then, I hope that this episode has helped you on your rise to the good life. Ciao. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of the Practical Stoic Podcast. If you'd like to stay up to date with the Practical Stoic community and everything to do with this podcast, then just go to my website, simonjedrew.com, and subscribe to the Practical Stoic Weekly, a newsletter that I send out every week with updates and all sorts of great Stoic insights. You can also find me everywhere online by searching Simon J. E. Drew. See you next time.